I am Seungmo Choi at the African Department of the IMF. Okay, we have the photos of Victoria Falls here. We see a striking difference between January and December last year, reflecting droughts in southern Africa. We also had big cyclones last year, and low-cost outbreaks are ongoing. Every year, millions of people are affected by natural disasters, and these disasters have disrupted food security in sub-Saharan Africa. In addition, we now have the COVID-19 pandemic, which is a big catastrophe that is making people even more hungry. The key questions we raise here: how is sub-Saharan Africa affected by climate change and weather-related disasters, and what can be done to make the region more resilient? So we start from the background. We will summarize some stylized facts about sub-Saharan Africa. Climate change broadly means rising temperatures and increasing rainfall anomalies. As the left chart shows, world temperatures have been rising, particularly since the 1980s. This coincides with the global rise in industrialization and related CO2 emissions. Most scientists agree that the frequency and intensity of weather-related disasters would likely increase as a result of climate change. As the right chart shows, we indeed see the frequency of natural disasters has been rising. In particular, sub-Saharan Africa has seen a faster increase in frequency than in the rest of the world. For example, since the 1980s, floods have increased sevenfold in sub-Saharan Africa compared to threefold globally. What should be also noted is that Africa is big and countries are affected differently by climate change. The left map shows that temperatures are rising across sub-Saharan Africa, but Southern Africa and Eastern Africa are seeing temperatures rise faster. The right map shows precipitation. Most areas are getting more rain compared to 30 years ago, but parts of Western and Southern Africa are drying up. So, given the diverse effects, even within a single economy, policies need to be designed to the specific climate change impacts a country is facing. Then how is the region affected by weather-related disasters? The left chart shows the number of disasters per year during 2000 to 2018. Half the countries in sub-Saharan Africa face at least one natural disaster per year. We see that epidemics and floods are often correlated. And then we look at the right chart. It shows the average annual number of people affected by disasters. What we see is that droughts in particular have huge impacts, and especially so in Southern Africa. Then, given this background, we go to the next section. The question is, what is the economic impact of climate change on sub-Saharan Africa? We would expect sub-Saharan Africa to be particularly vulnerable to climate shocks because a large fraction of its population works in agriculture. So they depend on agriculture. And a large fraction of people is living below the poverty line, as the chart is showing. Households who depend on agriculture are directly exposed to droughts, floods, and so on. And at the same time, low-income households tend to have low education, weak healthcare, and limited access to finance. These reduce their ability to cope with economic shocks. As a result, many Africans are in food insecurity. People become unhealthy because of that. Students drop out, and all this will ultimately damage the economy's productive capacity and worsen inequalities. As anticipated, we find that sub-Saharan Africa is much more impacted than the rest of the world. The first analysis that we present here is a nightlight regression to understand the short-term impact of weather anomalies. We are using nightlight data as a proxy for monthly economic activity at subnational level. Nightlight data are regressed on weather anomalies, where these anomalies are extreme temperatures or precipitation. We find that for these anomalies, economic activity declines, but by much more in Sub-Saharan Africa than in the rest of the world, and even more so in the Sahel area. This reflects the region's lack of resilience to climate change and highlights the need to rapidly develop adaptation measures. Now, we show the second analysis. So we know the intensity or frequency of disasters is increasing in Sub-Saharan Africa. And as we saw, economic activity is impacted more in Sub-Saharan Africa. Then what does it imply for longer-term growth? So this one is to regress medium-term growth, which is 5-year average growth on indicators related to disasters and some control variables. We introduced the intensity and the frequency of the disasters. The intensity variable is about when countries have disasters, do they tend to have more disruptive disasters or less disruptive disasters? The frequency variable is about during the 5-year period, how many disasters countries tend to have, normalized by the number of people who died from disasters. The result suggests that floods and droughts have significant impacts on Sub-Saharan African medium-term growth. All in all, one additional drought lowers annual medium-term growth by about 1% point in Sub-Saharan Africa, which is an impact a lot bigger than the one estimated for the global EMDs, emerging market and developing economies. Also, one additional flood lowers medium-term growth by about 0.5% point in Sub-Saharan Africa, which is again a lot bigger than for EMDs. Then, given all these, how to respond? Responding to climate change involves two approaches. Number one is mitigation, which is to reduce greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. Number two is adaptation, which is to adjust to changes in the climate. Now, Sub-Saharan Africa can contribute to mitigation through, let's say, phasing out energy subsidies or transitioning to green energy sources and so on, and reforestation too. But the region has limited influence on climate change compared with advanced economies or large emerging market economies. So in that sense, adaptation is important for Sub-Saharan Africa, and it's especially so, as discussed, Sub-Saharan Africa, because Sub-Saharan Africa is the most vulnerable to climate shocks. So adaptation is critical, especially at this time. Well-implemented adaptation measures could generate jobs in support of the economic recovery from the crisis. So now we outline some key considerations in terms of policy. The priority is to safeguard food security in Sub-Saharan Africa. It is the world's most food insecure region, but our analysis also shows that some key factors can reduce the chances of food insecurity. For example, access to finance would help households to survive at difficult times and allow them to invest in resilience ahead of a shock. The same goes for having access to targeted social assistance. Access to mobile networks enables people to have early warning systems and gives farmers information on food prices and weather. Robust housing would protect people and food storage from climate shocks. Combined with good sanitation and drainage systems, all these could prevent injuries and the spread of disease while ensuring safe drinking water. So here we are displaying the result for Ethiopia. We analyzed household surveys for Ethiopia, and the bottom two bars at the very bottom show the average probability of food insecurity for an average household following a shock. For a household with all these key factors, and for the household without these key factors. There is a very large gap between these two groups in terms of predicted probabilities of food insecurity. The difference is more than 40 percentage points. Now, boosting agricultural productivity. This is also important. In many places, farming is still done in a very traditional way. So we also analyzed household surveys about crop yields. The adverse weather conditions tend to affect crop yields by 40% in Ethiopia. But there is a scope to improve crop yields. For example, in Ethiopia, crop yields tend to increase with irrigation, improved seeds, insecticide, fertilizer, and so on. For the case of Rwanda, access to finance is also found to contribute. Fortunately, many countries in the region were proactive in terms of raising agricultural productivity. For example, Mozambique is a global pilot for heat-tolerant bean seeds, which are sort of newly developed. In Ethiopia, some farmers' yields rose up by up to 40% after the development of rust-resistant wheat varieties. What policy areas will be most critical for Sub-Saharan Africa to adapt to climate change? Now we are looking at sort of a macro level regression. For each type of disasters, this chart shows policy variables that help to improve the resilience. As an example, on improvement in electricity up to the average level in emerging market and developing economies could help in case of a drought, improved growth by 0.4 percent points. So this is about electricity. Electricity powers irrigation systems and so on. So there's playing a very important role, especially at the time of a drought. Another example is about health. So please look at the sky blue bar for the flood and a storm. Improving critical infrastructure, basically improvement in weather, in this case, up to the average level in EMDE countries, could help in case of a flood to improve growth by 0.2%. So more generally, also doing all these things can have positive spillovers to neighbors, as was the case of Beira Port in Mozambique, which is a critical shipping hub. Thanks to resilient infrastructure, the port was able to resume operations only 3 days after the cyclone Idai in March 2019. So all these things are important. Then an important issue is, okay, to build this kind of resilience, how do we finance this? So building resilience is generally expensive. For example, infrastructure, which is more resilient to weather shocks, is estimated to be 25% more expensive than regular infrastructure. Implementation of these strategies will be expensive and is estimated to be about $30 billion or $50 billion, which is 2 or 3% of regional GDP each year over the next decade, according to many experts. But on the other hand, given this, a huge need for financing, Sub-Saharan African countries have limited fiscal space. The fallout from COVID-19 is taking a toll on the region's already limited fiscal space. Some countries have large public debt, and there are competing financing needs in terms of SDGs, Sustainable Development Goals. Now, raising revenues is something countries can do, but there is a relatively a limited scope for many countries. There is some scope for improving spending efficiency, but again, the progress seems to be low, seems to be very slow. Finally, some sort of risk sharing across Sub-Saharan African countries would benefit. So that is great, especially at the time of disasters. but adaptation itself is still very costly. This implies the role of international community is very important. Investing now, so here is a good news. Investing now will be far less costly than the price of frequent disaster relief in the future, as this chart is showing. So in that sense, for donors to contribute to resilience building is good for donors because it is more welfare enhancing for the Sub-Saharan Africans. And it's also good for Sub-Saharan African countries because they face a huge challenge in terms of climate change. So to conclude, climate change takes a larger and more persistent toll on economic activity in Sub-Saharan Africa. And already large inequalities are being exacerbated. What can you do? The first first key area is to empower people. Healthcare and education are critical to building resilience. Policies to boost agricultural output and reduce its weather sensitivity would be extremely useful. And then the second is to enhance infrastructure. Targeted infra can contain damage from climate shocks. So equipping farmers with the right machinery will help, and widening coverage of mobile networks across rural areas would also help in terms of early warning and so on. And finally, number three is to strengthen coping mechanisms. After a climate shock, access to finance, social assistance, and insurance can act as buffers that can help people to cope. To conclude, these three policy areas could be considered, particularly when policies come to design the policies, particularly when countries come to design the policies to support the recovery. These policies will make the economy more resilient, but could also create jobs. For example, agricultural R&Ds can raise agricultural productivity, thus contributing to adaptation to climate change, but can also help to raise growth. So, in addition, a green recovery can help to protect the environment and could reduce the spread of future pandemics. Economic recovery from the pandemic and policies addressing climate change must go together to ensure a future for Sub-Saharan Africa that is more equitable, more sustainable, and more resilient. Thank you very much. Thank you very much.
So while Stephen comes on board, let me just throw a few questions your way you can be thinking about. First question is data reliability and all of this stuff. It's very interesting whether we can make conclusions on the basis of data in the region as well as others. Stephen, are you on board?
So Katya, first, thank you for putting on the slides here. I'd like to, again, begin by congratulating Sung Mo and his co-authors on producing such an interesting and informative report that will no doubt lead to some discussions. So going to the first slide, what I have to say is I had a very slow and small window in which to put together my response. So perhaps paradoxically, that means I have lots of bullet points and lots of slides. So as Leibniz said, if I had more time, I would have been briefer. But I won't go through all of these. I want to say there are some important contributions. I thought it was a good summary on impacts to date, in particular in Sub-Saharan Africa, of disaster incidents. Unfortunately, there are more kinds of disasters. In addition, these were very well done. I liked the way that the focus was not just on income, but throughout not just your own report, your own presentation, but the report was on human capabilities and not just income. Just a focus just on income impacts. Might be understandable for maybe a reinsurance company, but the IMF is part of the UN, and I liked very much the way that was done. Earlier on, we saw impact reports on climate change that said, you have the largest impact in the US and small in Africa. Then that was based upon income. In the sense that starting from a low level of income, even if your income is drastically reduced, it's a small amount in terms of dollar impact. So I like the focus on percentage-based impacts and growth-based impacts throughout your presentation. I thought that was very good. I liked, and I thought it was innovative, the focus on financing resilience and adaptation, which are slightly different, as being cheaper than frequent disaster relief. There are a couple of caveats about that I will come to. I like the way that you were addressing as basic problems for countries to adapt as a whole, things we often think about as problems of basic extreme poverty, sanitation, safe drinking water, hunger, as you focused on in your report, and so on. We know the best ability to adapt comes from being richer. And so a focus on raising income is important. At the same time, I liked your focus on safety nets, on the importance of education, and so on. It's a big contrast from an income-only focus, fiscal focus. So I thought that was very good. And I also liked the major focus, which you concluded on, of course, on the need for special assistance. So going to the next slide. I first of all, I want to say that your focus also on targeting the importance of finance was very, very good indeed. So, just a few caveats and suggestions to begin with. Impacts of climate change are, of course, inclusive of the sudden disasters that you mentioned. We also know there are the slow motion disasters, desertification, which was mentioned in your report, I have to say, but not part of that analysis. But water resources, crop yields going down, spreads of pests and diseases. I think that Louise mentioned the locust epidemic this year, sea level rise, loss of grasslands, loss of farmlands. All of these are also disasters. It's just that they are slow moving, and being slow moving, it's harder to get attention to them. I thought you had some very good examples of resilience. I liked your organizing of that. There are also some other very good examples, which is encouraging. It means that there's a lot of optimism. And I thought that one that would have fit with some of the themes of what your presentation were hydromet stations and outreach from them. That's been a very interesting and effective approach. I do want to offer a caveat for you regarding the latter part of your presentation today, in which policy analysis based on cross-country analysis was done. I mean, I don't disagree with the basic points, but we never have figured out endogeneity here after decades now, and it's something that really probably cannot be solved, right? Because bad policies are just associated with bad conditions, because policy being endogenous, when conditions are bad, policies that might be bad in other cases are second best, maybe even third best. So I think that we have to be careful there to say we compare policies across countries and therefore we tell countries, well, they better do these other policies when they have conditions that might make that very difficult. I refer to various papers by Danny Roderick and various co-authors on that. I think it's pretty convincing. And I think being careful of words like impact and effect is also very important when causality is difficult to focus on and to prove. That we are all guilty to this. That's the language of regression. You talk about the effect and the impact. I mean, unfortunately, that's kind of a language that we use. So there's nothing special in a criticism here whatsoever. I think it's just important to be careful here. And I think the call for more aid was very important. And here, I think it's important to sharpen the difference between conventional aid and adaptation aid. They're really not the same. There's very strong overlap, but there are key differences. Also, I have a slide that I won't go through further on, but I also have an IIEP blog that describes these differences, which I think might be interesting from the point of view of your call for more aid, and it's in the 13th edition of the text that James mentioned. And on the next slide, for the next slide, Katya? Yeah. So one of the things that I thought we're missing here that I would commend to your further, consideration as you continue with this, naturally much of what you talked about, which is very appropriate from the IMF giving advice to governments, but most of what you talked about is what we might call planned or policy adaptation. It's steps that either are taken by government or perhaps should be or could be effectively taken by government. But in reality, most adaptation, I mean, I have to think about how to define most, right? But adaptation will in large part be done by individuals, by families, by communities, as well as by firms. So the private sector, but not just the private sector. And so that government policies can either augment and make that easier and more effective, or it can do the reverse. So I have some various, examples here, but the response of individuals and villages and so on to climate change can be constructive, can be adaptive, can also be maladaptive, short run beneficial, long run not, very often spillovers that are negative to other communities, drawing down common property resources, farmers moving into to new areas and so on. So that needs to be taken into account with this problem of adaptation to climate change. There are a lot of externalities at work and interactive effects. So if government policy can be effective, it should take into account that these are the ways people are already responding, and these are the ways that they are likely to respond, and think in terms of reducing the effect of these negative externalities and so on, doing what they can to assist the goals of those adapting. I think this is quite important. So I thought that your discussion about finance is very important. So I thought that your discussion of finance was very important, and that innovation in finance is extremely important here. Adaptation assistance, first of all, reduces disaster costs. And I thought that was a terrific analysis, doing some specifics on that, not just talking about it as a general principle, but talking about specific disasters, and if they could be presented, what disaster assistance would this lower. It also has the assumption that donor governments are going to plan assistance whenever there's a if given the facts that governments would provide more assistance, realizing these are good investments. And I hope that's true, and I wish it were true. Another possibility is that governments respond in a large way to disasters only after their publics, view this on television or social media or whatever, and pressure government to respond. I think it would be a difficult sell to governments, and so I commend your initiative to sell that, and I think that the specifics that you've come up with in terms of, in a sense, rate of return, how much you would save by investing now, is terrific. But no matter how much government assistance, multilateral and bilateral, can be brought to bear for Sub-Saharan Africa for these new problems of climate adaptation and resilience, it's still not going to be enough. The numbers involved are simply staggering. They're beyond the resources of the IMF, the World Bank, all organizations, and so on. So we have to have private sector engagement, which means we have to have, investment in activities that lead to adaptation and resilience. This has been figured out much more effectively for mitigation, where if you have a solar farm, for example, that provides a stream of revenue, and if necessary, perhaps there can be guarantees provided that would encourage that investment. And in your report, you talked about the potential role of guarantees. The issue that we've tried to grapple with here as an IIEP project is what to do in terms of guarantees when there's not an obvious revenue stream. So many of the things that you've described just don't have a revenue stream. I don't think that we're going to be asking extreme poor people to be repaying on a regular monthly schedule. So I don't think that this has been a solved problem, but I think it's one that would be very useful to engage further. So on the next slide, we will discuss this later. This is, among other things, what's different here is described in detail in an IIEP blog that Kyle can post later. But I think that's an important part of the focus here. And next slide. I have just a few concluding comments for you then. So first of all, it's great to see the IMF engaging in this topic, and in particular, engaging on it with respect to Sub-Saharan Africa. I'm just delighted to see this. And I think the report, as I've said, is an important contribution. And among other things, the report itself points out future work that's needed. Your concluding bullet point of a moment ago, I also got from the report as being just really fundamental and great to see. The economy and the environment are not mutually exclusive, and that's absolutely right. And so in earlier reports, for example, World Bank reports of a number of years ago, there would be the thought that, well, there's just they're just substitutes, the environment and the economy, and you can trade them off. But they're inescapably complements now, and I'm delighted to see that. And so I'll just make a final note in case as a goal being a responsible citizen, and that is that adaptation is absolutely essential, but it is also essential to assist with mitigation in Africa too. Most of what needs to be done and can be done in sheer volume is in high-income countries. So it's going to be more feasible to build resilience and to build capacity to adapt and to adapt if there's less additional climate change coming their day, right? So that climate change impacts have been accelerating, so that's certain, and that's very difficult to respond in itself, let alone without a lot more coming that is already in. So with that, I thank you very much, and I greatly appreciated your report. Thank you.